All good.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event, which is sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Journalists, Professional Journalists. My name is Stella Lawrence, and I'm here today with Washington Post columnist and author Taylor Lorenz. Taylor covers technology and online culture for The Post. She has previous bylines in the New York Times business section, The Atlantic, and The Daily Beast as a technology reporter. And she was also a 2019 Night Visiting Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, where her research focused on Instagram and news consumption. She's here today to talk to us about her incredible journalism career, her recent book titled Extremely Online: The Untold Story of Fame, Influence, and Power on the Internet, and the harassment journalists and especially women face online. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Um, I did get a chance to read your book, and so I'm really excited to
Oh my
discuss it with you.
God.
I really
Thank
enjoyed
you
it.
so much for reading it. That means a lot.
But I want to start way, way back. So, as I understand it, you did not grow up aspiring to be a journalist with bylines in the Times or the Post. So, what did you want to be when you grew up, and how did you find your way into this industry and this beat?
Good question. I wanted to be an artist. I went to art school and I just was always really creative and I thought that that's what I would do. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I just started working really young and had a million jobs and um, yeah, I kind of just wanted to make art and be do creative things. And then I graduated into the recession, the 2008, it was the 2008 recession. And so there was no jobs really. It was a economic crisis like a lot of millennials. And that was also right when there was this like boom of blogging and it was the earliest days of social media. And so this girl at one of my temp jobs, introduced me to Tumblr and that really changed my life. I got addicted to it. And then I started blogging and that a bunch of people followed me and I got sort of known on the internet. And then at the time when if you were popular online, there was like no money in it. So the only thing you could really do is sort of like leverage it into some industry. So at first I worked at an ad agency for a year running social media accounts for brands. But I really liked news and I liked sort of like I wanted to write about the internet because I felt like the coverage of the internet was so bad back then. So I took a job doing social media at the Daily Mail, and then that kind of got me into journalism.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a story that sounds familiar out of your book for sure. But you've kind of built it up, and now you've been called the country's premier chronicler of internet culture. So through your experience, how did you actually cultivate that as your beat, and how do you kind of define or explain it to people now?
Yeah, I wanted to write about tech from the user side. I felt like, I mean, especially when there was this boom of software, social media platforms and everything exploding in the early 2010s. There was a ton of gadget blogging, so people would write about gadgets, like here's how I use my new MacBook Pro or here's how I use the Chromebook, whatever. But people weren't doing it as much for the social media side of things. And so I've always wanted to tell the story of social media through the user side because I felt like these platforms were only being covered through the lens of like the business stuff, like who's Mark Zuckerberg appointing to the board or whatever. And so, yeah, I was really inspired by a lot of the early gadget bloggers and, I wanted to write about social media from the user side. Also because the media coverage of the internet was so bad. It's still bad, but it was really bad back then if you go back. I mean, they were calling YouTube a site for cat videos. It was like fundamentally unserious. They were shitting on anybody that was growing an audience, especially women. And so I was like, okay, I actually am in this world. My friends are in this world. I'm going to actually write about it from the perspective of somebody that kind of takes it seriously.
Sure. Um, Now that you kind of are in it and in this world, as you've mentioned in your book, and so legacy media and sort of a certain older generation, they were kind of slow to come around and take it seriously. How do you work with, maybe editors or others of a certain generation who might not be as social media literate as you? Have you had to change your approach for them?
No, I don't think it's a age issue actually. I mean, I totally changed my mind on this because my editor who just retired and I would die for him. He's 72 and he deserved to retire, but he was one of probably the best editor I've ever had, and was an amazing editor, just understood stories, understood power structures, understood wanting to challenge power and like wanting to explain the dynamics of the internet. Like he didn't understand those, he wasn't on TikTok that much, but like he got it. And so I think that's what you need. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of that in legacy news. Legacy news, it's establishment stuff, and it's a lot about, you know, it's not an environment that I ever sort of aspired to be in for that reason. But there are these really good editors. So I'm lucky that I've had good editors. But it's yeah, I mean it's an educational thing. Of course, I just wrote a story on brain rot, and I did have to explain the word gooning to an editor. So there's those moments, but you know, that's like any beat. Like anyone that has a weird beat. My friend at work covers like aeronautics stuff, and he's having to explain everything. So I always just say the internet is kind of just it's just another world, and you have to educate people on it.
Sure. I want to, before we kind of dive into your book, I want to take a minute to talk about a really big story that you broke back in April of 2019. You broke a story revealing the person who is behind the far-right account, Libs of TikTok. So can you walk us through a little bit of how you reported that story and then what came out of it?
Yeah, I've done a lot of reporting on, I cover online influence. So I've covered a lot of right-wing online influencers. I covered the Trump campaign in 2016, which was that was like the half the campaign was just like these influencers. So yeah, with her, with Haya, sorry about all the noise. She had essentially been acting as this like assignment editor for all of right-wing media. And I had been watching her grow and her power grow, and sort of unchecked, and no one had revealed her identity. And so I've done a few other stories where I've revealed people's identity if it's in the public interest, and I was kind of waiting for her to reach that bar. It came out that one, she had received a couple $1 million in funding from Seth Dillon, who's a right-wing entrepreneur behind the Babylon Bee. And then also she was directly informing, according to Christine Pushaw, who is DeSantis's press secretary, directly informing legislation in Florida, like the Don't Say Gay bill. So I was like, okay, if this Twitter account is directly informing state anti-LGBTQ laws, literally like assigning what's going to be on Fox News the next day, and accepting tons of money and growing her presence, like, and increasingly cited by the mainstream media, by the way, we should, it's in the public interest to report on who she is. And so I wanted to do that. So I did.
Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on kind of how you uncovered that story?
Yeah, well, she didn't take steps to hide it very well at all. Like, I mean, I think for a lot of average people, maybe you're not going to, you know, do research or whatever, go and check like domain registration and stuff. But myself, this researcher Travis Brown, who has done tons of amazing work, I think he actually got banned from Twitter for all of his reporting, but he had dug into her as well. And so there was sort of like rumors that it was this woman Hayaraichek, and Hayaraichek is actually a pretty common name. And so I wanted to figure out, okay, which Hayaraichek is this? Let me let me confirm. Da, 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 da. I knew that she was in LA as well because she had given this interview to the New York Post where she talked about moving to California. And so I had found a Hayaraichek that had moved from New York to California. And so I found her address through domain registration, look up software stuff. And I just drove over because I tried to call her, by the way, tried to call her many times, tried to DM her many times, tried to get comment for literally weeks. And she was just blowing me off. And I was like, well, if you are going to reveal someone's name publicly, in kind of a controversial way, you have to seek comment, obviously. And so I've sought comment many, many times in person. And so I went to her house, and actually her posting, it was really Glenn Greenwald and her posting, because they basically, her mother answered the door. She's like, hiding inside, whatever. But the mother answers the door and is like, go away. We're not giving you comment, whatever. And then she posted a picture that she had taken of me through the window on the door. Like the door had one of those little like windows. And so actually, I was telling my editor, we were laughing because even when I had left the house, I hadn't actually spoken directly to her. And so we were gonna like have to couch the story in all these weird ways. And then when Glenn Greenwald tweeted that and she shared it, being like, "You were at my house today," I was like, "Oh, okay." Then I 100% did have the right hire right check, and I know everything about your identity, and I can report it now. So I don't know if they realized that, but yeah, it was funny.
Wow. That's kind of a crazy story. Like she took a picture of you through the window and oh my gosh.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, she's a weirdo, but yeah.
well, so after that story came out and others like it, you actually then sat down with an interview for her. And the
Yeah,
whole
just recently.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
I, oh,
oh go
sorry.
ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to tell you, I had written this big 2,500 word piece on her, she's appointed to the state school board in Oklahoma. And so I had written about after Next Benedict's death, I had written about just the harm basically that's being done to LGBTQ people in Oklahoma. And it really sort of told the stories of these LGBTQ young people that were suffering because of essentially policies that she's endorsed and enabled through her position as on this education board. And so I again had to seek comment from her. And I had messaged her many times. And then she said in an offhand comment, "I'll give it to you in person or something." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, 100%. I would love that." And then she was like, "I'll give you just 5 minutes, only 5 minutes." And then the minute that she sat down, I could tell that she has actually never done an interview before and was completely on media trained and like could not control the interview even remotely. So it
Yeah,
kind of didn't go great for her. I can't believe she agreed to it. It was so dumb of her to agree to it. But
well, I think the final interview it ended up because I think you posted the whole thing, right? It ended up being like hours long and
yeah, it was a little over an hour.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big discussion, by the way, to get to post that. I mean, that's technically like the product of that interview was me getting comment. One, I wanted to get comment on the Oklahoma stuff, but I also wanted to get comment on all this other stuff that I knew other reporters had sought comment from her on. Like I had spoken to a bunch of trans activists and a Jewish journalist as well who had tried to get a comment from her on the Great Replacement Theory. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get comment for my story, but I'm also going to try to just get comment for like everyone reporting on her because there's a bunch of it. Will Carlos is another phenomenal reporter at the USA Today who's written a lot about her. So I was like, I'm going to actually like try to get her to talk about her ideology, which by the way, she cannot defend at all. Um, and so anyway, that was sort of the goal, but I wasn't that interview was essentially source material. And so I did have to have a lot of long conversations at the Washington Post with my editor and, the standards department. Like they all had to watch that and allow me to sign off on me putting it online because normally we don't put reporting source material online. But I was arguing that interview, yes, it's like source material. I mean, like you're reporting your actual, like you wouldn't like put your reporting notes up somewhere, right? Or like the full transcript of an interview for a written piece. And that in that context, I said we should, one, because she said a lot of newsworthy comments and we weren't going to run like 12 separate pieces on everything she said. And two, she would have probably tried to deceptively edit it and take things out of context. And I didn't want that to happen. And so that's why the whole thing was online.
I'm just kind of curious, as you've sourced this beat, was that kind of like a first experience for you, or as you've kind of had to source contacts like her, have there been other experiences where you're like, oh, I realize now, like, this might be your first time speaking to the
A
media?
lot of them. Yeah, a lot of them. I mean, normally, when I found Jalea Harmon, which took a couple months, by the way, the girl, she was 13 or 14 at the time, who created the Renegade dance. She was just a random girl in outside Atlanta. That was the end of 2019, right when TikTok was blowing up. Also Charlie D'Amelio, like all of these like content creators and people like Jalea, where like Jalea was essentially an unknown teenager that had no following, that had created the most viral dance ever, which now it started. I mean, that story ultimately like sort of cascaded and became this broader conversation around credit. But at the time, she couldn't get anywhere. She couldn't get anything. And that took a long time to find her. And I called her mother at work. Her mother worked at a school. And I was like, do you know that your daughter created this? And she didn't even know. So there's a lot of things like that where I'm like, okay, well, look, I know that your daughter is a child. And I've interviewed a lot of children. So I try to be very sensitive. I think if you're a right-wing hate monger, I'm not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. If you're a 14-year-old who created a viral dance, like I'll do my best to kind of ensure that you're comfortable being interviewed and work with your parents or whatever. but a lot of people I cover, they're internet personalities. So some of them, and I'm usually covering them right at the beginning of their careers. So they aren't necessarily like, they're not always media trained. And that's just, I think that's actually one of the benefits of my beat compared to covering corporations where they have huge PR teams.
Sure. That's a pretty good segue to speaking about your book. So it came out in October, and as you mentioned, it really looks specifically at how users, rather than sort of these Silicon Valley CEOs, are shaping these platforms that we know today. Obviously, the space is really still evolving and often at kind of this breakneck pace. So how did you decide that it was time to write this book and chronicle everything up until now?
Yeah, I got the book deal right before the pandemic started. So it was just 2020, like 2020. I was like, why not? Like it seemed like the end of one era of social media and the beginning of another. Um, and I think the pandemic really crystallized that. Like it was ironic that the pandemic happened right after. I wish I got my book deal 3 months later. I could have actually made money on it, but that's fine. I got it when I had to pitch that book. I was like really trying to explain to people that this was a thing and they did not get it. And they're like, okay, you can write your little book. And I was like, no, 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 it's like going to be big. And then the pandemic hit and it was like not even a question anymore. Because everyone became super online and I think the media was forced to recognize the online world as this important space. Um, and yeah, I mean, I wanted to write about essentially the first 20 years of the social internet and kind of what it brought and what we saw and the relationships between these platforms. There's been so many great tech books that are just platform specific. And I wanted to sort of pull out and look at the whole ecosystem and tell the story from the user side.
Wow, that's like a story I read over and over in your book, and I can't believe it happened for actually getting the book to
It
be
was really
created.
hard
People didn't,
to
it
get
was kind of right
anybody to
before.
understand. They
Yeah,
literally suggested, like, at one point, they're like, this doesn't make any sense. Why would you want to write about this? Why don't you write a like history of memes or something? And I was like, what? It just was it's a different climate now. And my friend just got a book deal for writing a book about like mommy influencers and stuff, which is amazing. It's like I'm so happy that these types of books can follow my books. I think my book kind of opened the door, and also because it did really well, it like made people, I think a lot of editors and people take this industry seriously and be like, what other, books can we get in this space? Like, and I think that's just a really good thing. So I'm happy.
yeah. Congratulations. I'm glad that it's doing well because it really was a fascinating read. Um, so as you mentioned, it kind of pulls out these key moments. And what struck me as I read it was that you kind of had to explain like things that seem normal now were actually revolutionary at the time. That kept coming up. This was revolutionary at the time. Things like socialite rank or the very first collab house. How did you kind of pinpoint those key moments, or how did you decide which stories, which anecdotes to include?
Yeah, I mean, there was so much. My original draft was twice as long. I tried to just like hit all the major. I mean, it's like the first collab house is like that is something that started this entire industry. Or, a lot of them, it's like these moments that had ultimately they seemed like passing things, but they were actually seminal moments in internet history that really shaped the landscape of the internet or shaped these platforms themselves. So I mean, I just wanted to pick out like the main things. And then the stories that I told, I really wanted to tell people's stories that hadn't been told. I think we've heard again so much from the tech executives. I think like so much of the entire really influencer content creator industry was built by women. And that story was totally, I mean, it's continually dismissed. And so I knew that I wanted to tell a lot of women's stories. Also, I'm a woman, so I just care a lot about women's history. And I think women are often written out of history when it comes to technology. And so, women and a lot of just sort of like LGBTQ people. One story that didn't make it in my book, it got cut, but it was Ingrid Nielsen's story. I don't know if you remember her, but she was one of the original beauty vloggers, and she was the first influencer face of CoverGirl. She made this seminal coming out video in 2015 that really like changed, sorry, it's my landlord, changed the landscape. So there was a lot of stuff like that that ultimately got cut or condensed and stuff. But yeah.
So were some of those key moments, are they just a little bit easier to spot in hindsight, or were there things from, or even now that you cover where you're like, oh, this is a shift and people don't see it yet, but I do.
Well, I think there's moments, I mean, like when TikTok launched or things like that, where I'm like, oh, okay, this is obviously going to be the biggest thing, right? Um, and then you look back at other things like Gamergate, where I think none of us realized how much that would shape culture, how that would just become culture essentially online. Sorry, this is my landlord. Um, I'm just telling him I'm on a call. My like ceiling fell in. It's fine. Um, so yeah, I mean I think looking back, hindsight is always 2020, but there were some things. A lot of it too.
Oh, uh-oh, I think we lost your audio when you. No, not yet. Oh, Adam, she muted herself by accident. Can you Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, nope, still can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay. We're
Okay,
back.
all right. I think it's just not going to work on there anymore, but I'll just talk without my podcast mic. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it sounds fine. Thanks.
Okay, cool. I don't even remember what I was saying.
Um, yeah, well, we can reset.
Sorry, technical
No
difficulties.
worries, no worries. It happens to the best of us. So you had mentioned earlier about how even kind of with your book coming out and kind of pioneering this space, now people are starting to take it seriously. They're starting to see some of the shifts that you saw early on. Has that changed actually how you approach your coverage? I mean, is it harder to kind of find the next big thing now that more people are looking?
No, I would say it's been a little bit of a weight off. I was talking to another internet culture reporter that's also a little bit younger than me, but she's been in it for a while, and like slightly a weight off my shoulders. But like I used to feel like if I don't cover this, no one will cover this. Like it is being ignored. Now I don't feel that way, which is so great because it allows me to focus more on the like stories that I care about and less incremental stories. Also, there's this entire industry of content creators online and YouTubers that do an amazing job of and podcasters breaking down online culture coverage. And I just think that is so incredible. And I love those people because it was not that way even a decade ago. It was just not. And so it was much smaller. And even now we don't have very many internet culture reporters. There's way fewer internet culture reporters for the whole internet than there are just Facebook reporters covering just the business of Facebook. So I think it's just a wildly understaffed beat, and it's crazy how few people do this in newsrooms. But it's really hard also to do in a traditional newsroom. It's kind of a tough beat because you're kind of all over the place. But yeah, I wish there were like 50 more reporters, but I really love, and it's almost all women, mostly women. There's a few men, but it's almost all women that cover the beat, which I think is interesting too.
Huh. Why do you think that is?
I think tech reporting generally is a very male field, and I think a lot of men had like they gravitate towards gadget reporting. I mean, you have people like Joanna Stern, that's an amazing personal tech columnist, it's a woman, but most of the sort of hardware reporting is done by men. I think women seem to end up doing the more culture coverage side of it. And I think part of it is sexism, but part of it is also just like, I think women, as a woman, you're very attuned to things that are happening online. My beat is very like pop culture adjacent too, and entertainment adjacent, and that those beats have always been dominated by women. So yeah, I think it's led to a lot of men not taking it seriously. And it's interesting to see a couple of men that have come onto the beat in recent years, and like it's like almost made a lot of these people take it more seriously, where they're like, oh, it's not just like, and also the platforms evolved. I remember when they first started calling me like a TikTok reporter, like on all Fox News and stuff, they're like, she's a TikTok reporter. And I'm like, yes, it reminded me so much of how they used to talk about YouTube,
Hmm.
because they would be like, oh, she's YouTube, that's cat videos. And it's like, no, this is a major global social platform. So if you want to say if you want to associate me with that, that's actually a good thing. I think it just shows the like level of dismissiveness that you get from some of these other people.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that you wish there were like 50 more people on the beat because it's very different from how I feel like more traditionally experienced journalists like talk about their beats almost like very possessive and competitive. So
Then you're a bad journalist, to be
yeah, it's kind
honest.
of
Then you're
it's
a bad
refreshing to
journalist.
hear that.
If that's
Yeah.
how you feel about your beat, you're a bad journalist because that, first of all, you're not collaborative. And also the goal is to get these stories told and to get them out there and to change people's perception and to educate people. So it's a complete, like, if somebody is saying that type of stuff, then they're actually in journalism for their own ego. And it's not about, and I hate that. I hate that so much. That's one of my biggest problems with legacy media. It's very like zero sum kind of thing. And it's like, I just want, the stories out there. And also on my beat, people trade stories, they give away stories, trade as in like, if I can't do a story, but it's a good story, I'm not just going to sit on it. Like I will give it to another reporter, ideally a younger reporter, or vice versa. And I think that's how it should be. And I think it's toxic. I hate that attitude, basically, that, you know, but most people at the Post are not like that, to be honest.
That's good to hear. We're going to circle kind of back close to that toward the end, but I want to kind of stick with your book for one more moment just to say, so the ending, I really kind of found that you struck sort of this optimistic tone at the end, and there was a call to embrace the role that we share as users and creators online. But, throughout the book, you also included plenty of anecdotes about influencer burnout and harassment and kind of the challenges of really making it and being successful online. So what do you hope that people ultimately take away from reading your book?
I hope that they realize the internet is not a terrible, evil thing. I hope they realize the revolutionary power of social media and being connected. The entire promise of the internet is to connect the world. And I think that that is a fundamentally good thing. I think it's been warped by these horrible, evil companies that make everything about profit, like Google and Facebook and stuff. But fundamentally, like there is a reason why, for instance, right now the government is trying to ban TikTok, and it's not national security. It's just simply not. It is largely about restricting speech. And you see this across the board with a lot of these bills that are in Congress and in states right now. I think we're seeing a huge backslide where first these platforms talked, and the whole tech industry was like all about like liberatory social media, yay, yay, yay. And then when people started to use these platforms to question power here in America, because they totally championed things like the Arab Spring and using social media to question power abroad. But once we saw movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all these things emerge that challenged power here, now we have all this bipartisan efforts to censor speech online, to restrict social media use among especially young people and young progressive groups. So I think it's very bad and very dangerous. And I think people should not write off the whole internet just because we have a bad experience with Facebook. Facebook has done horrible things. But, there are a lot of less profit-driven models of social media that we could adapt. We can push these platforms to be better. They are ultimately accountable to us, the users. And so we should take more of a, I don't want to say ownership because we don't have ownership of these platforms, but we should voice our, we should use the internet. We should not just retreat. I think there's this whole movement to just log off, which I totally, if that makes you personally like good for your mental health, if you want to do that. But I'm just saying broadly, we need to fight for civil liberties online, and we need a less profit-driven social media ecosystem.
Do you see, or maybe where do you see just kind of journalism with a capital J, the industry, and even in like legacy publications fitting into that call to action? I'm curious.
Good question. I mean, I think that again, part of the reason we're seeing this crackdown right now on speech, and I'm not talking about crackdown on free speech the way like Elon Musk is saying it, because he doesn't actually care about these things, but like, this for instance, all of the attacks against digital media companies, the lawsuits filed by places like ClearLock to essentially, or Peter Thiel, the way he drove Gawker out of business, like there is an assault on journalism and the free press and the media, and it's really escalated since 2016, really 2015. And so I think we need to fight that. And I think legacy media companies are unfortunately woefully underprepared. I think most of them do not understand how the internet works. They're ultimately concerned with their own business models, which they should be, but I do think that we have a bit of a crisis. At the same time, I am a huge believer in independent journalism. And I do think a lot of that is happening online. It's just that we don't have a lot of business models to support that. The ad-driven business model that supported the legacy media ecosystem, there's no sort of way to easily replicate that online. So we have these ecosystems of content creators that are sort of just dependent on these platforms, which are really bad platforms. So I would love to see more independent journalism generally. I think that's the best way. I don't trust a lot of legacy institutions. I don't trust the legacy media to necessarily like, only because there's not that much of it left to like save journalism or whatever. It's like it's been gutted. It's gone. Like, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of local newspapers have shut down. We can't get those back. So we need to figure out new kind of models.
Yeah, it's you actually posted a lot of what you just said in a video a little bit earlier this year. It was right after the LA Times layoffs, massive layoffs
Yeah.
came following, spate of other layoffs in the industry. Um, I feel like a lot of what you said in that video and a lot of what you said now is things that kind of we as journalists know like deep down, but it can be like a really hard pill to swallow, I think. Um, what gives you hope for the industry, and what advice do you have for young journalists who are, or maybe even aspiring journalists who are kind of trying to get their foot in the door?
Well, my main piece of advice that I cannot stress strong enough is do not go into legacy media when you're young. That is a stupid thing to do. Like if maybe, okay, if you get a New York Times fellowship right out of college, do the fellowship for a year. Do not try to rise the ranks like of these places. Because what I see is so many young journalists, they come out of journalism school. They're very like, they're, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but like these schools teach you to value prestige and name brand places. And it's this sense of accomplishment. And then I know, I mean, I talk to a lot of young people. I know you graduate, you see, oh, so-and-so is interning at the AP, so-and-so, these are great places. If you can get an internship, sure, do it. But what you should do when you're young is optimize for experience. And it's much better to work at a startup or work for a content creator or work for a podcaster or teach yourself digital skills that can be competitive and then ultimately work at these places. But if you try to get hired and then you get in these places at a very low level, it's first of all, the world where you like climb the corporate ladder like doesn't exist. Maybe that happens for like 5% of people. It ultimately doesn't. And I've seen a lot of young people get in this trap where they get a job at a prestigious place. They work there maybe from 23 to 28, 30. They're like, all right, I've been here for 7 years. I'm still just like an editorial assistant or like a junior reporter. I'm not really going anywhere. Also, I have no experience outside this institution. I'm not very nimble. And then they get leapfrogged by the people that have basically been doing their own thing. I also don't have a huge hope for legacy media generally. So I think it's just do not jump into a sinking ship, as they say. Like, be careful with your own career and don't just don't ever value like name brand anything or prestige anything, because it's helpful. I mean, I'm not saying don't take those opportunities, but don't let yourself get caught up in their thing because they gaslight you so much. Like, I mean, I just see this happen to young journalists where it's like the whole industry is built on like prestige sort of shit and awards and like it's not a good thing to do when you're young. If you're in your 30s, okay, or 40s or whatever, it's like, all right, you're a little more established, going to a legacy place. Maybe that offers a level of stability. Maybe you can work with people, like, sure. But I think when you're young, just try to get as much experience in a wide range of places because that's what the legacy places ultimately want. So you can still end up at the New York Times. And you might also hate it. You might also realize that when you get to those places, they're not what you wanted. So it's, I don't know. I think journalism schools it's a little hard. I never went to journalism school, but I talked to kids from journalism school and it's like, they're often being told to take these jobs that I'm like, oh no, they shouldn't do that. So, but also take any job you can get. I'm not saying don't take a job, like, if it's on the table, but that's my advice.
Sure. We have a question in the chat. It says, do you think it's possible for social media platforms to be less toxic? Content creators like Dylan Mulvaney have built huge followings on platforms that also feature tons of hateful content about them. Is it possible for a platform to have free speech without being a toxic cesspool?
Absolutely, 100%. I think it's a decision by these platforms to make them so toxic. And the reason they're doing that is because they prioritize engagement. First of all, they treat engagement neutrally, and a hate comment is just the same as a positive comment, and they ultimately optimize for engagement and profit. So we need less profit-driven social media platforms. I think if you look at a lot of the sort of, I mean, they're like places that not a lot of average people spend time, but like Mastodon or, like all these, like my colleague Will is obsessed with all these like Fediverse platforms and stuff. Like they do have better communities because they are less profit driven. I think ultimately it's what we need to push these platforms for is more user controls. I don't think it's necessarily a problem for people to say whatever they want to say. And I say that no doxing, no slurs, like within reason, right? As long as you can sort of moderate around it and like they have, I don't have to see that on my own page, like giving users a lot of controls. I think one thing that Twitter did finally, like, although Elon's been trying to like reverse it, is just allow who can respond to you. And they should have quote tweets off too, I feel like, but just allowing users to set better boundaries around their own online experience, I think is a good thing. Because sometimes you do kind of want to engage more heavily, or you do kind of want to fight with someone or something, I don't know. And then sometimes you don't. You want to just post to the people, for instance, in your small group. I think things like close friends, ephemeral content is also really good. I think having these permanent feeds everywhere of everything everyone's ever posted. I love it as a journalist, but I think it's not always great. Not because it's somebody said something problematic. It's more just like there's more surface area for harassments to happen. So yeah, I don't have a ton of faith that the platforms will do better. I think we are in this horrible duopoly between Meta and Google, and they just have no incentive to make their products better for a lot of marginalized people, but they could be they could be better, I think.
Yeah, having it come from the users is definitely a different conversation than you hear often, which is these companies trying to balance, top-down
I'm
regulation.
not a huge fan. I am against top-down moderation, and I know that that is a controversial thing to say. Again, I'm not talking about doxing. I'm not talking about like hateful comment. That, yes, top-down moderation all the way. I'm very against policing the companies themselves policing disinformation, because I think what we've seen, especially since the Trump presidency and 2016, but also we've seen in the past 4 years, facts evolve. Like what the companies rely on when you ask them to police disinformation is they just simply rely on information from the government. And I think we've seen, any reporter can tell you the government lies all the time. That is why we have journalism, to hold them accountable, because they're spewing their own stuff. So we really need fact-based news organizations to be able to report and not get censored. And it, unfortunately, even, I mean, the way that Meta is downranking political content, it's affected Washington Post. Like I've had I've had articles I've written taken down for disinformation, which is crazy. It's on the Washington Post. It's correct, So I'm very against that type of, I don't think that it's the social media company's job to do that. I think we desperately need better media literacy, and that's a whole separate problem almost outside of them.
Mm-hmm. We have
But not everyone agrees with me on that, by the way, but it's just my own take.
sure. We have a few minutes left. We do have another question in the chat, but before I get to that one, since we've kind of been on this topic, you've mentioned doxing and harassment and hate speech, and we know that those are huge issues on these platforms, and you yourself have experienced some of that. How do you protect yourself and deal with these kinds of incidents when this kind of deep online work and involvement is really kind of central to your work?
Yeah, it's been an evolving thing. I cover a lot of fandoms. So, I mean, even before now, I think in the past few years, a lot of these like right-wing influencers have become very powerful and obviously are vocal about me. But even before that, like the PewDiePie standum or Jake Paulers, like Jake Paulers doxed me in 2017 when I wrote about Team 10 and sexual assault allegations against him. So like, I think I have a friend that covers Marvel, and she's an entertainment reporter, and like those fans are also insane and have doxed her and swatted her and stuff. So I think unfortunately, any reporter now that covers anything that touches on fandom, you have to deal with it, and you have to have a very high threshold. And I'm very intense about privacy for that reason. Like I don't post anything really personal about like my own family or stuff like that. But aside from that, I don't know. It's more of an emotional thing of like psychologically dealing with it, which I think I'm pretty good at now, but we all have bad days, I don't know. Depends.
Yeah. Does what you cover and the way you cover it affect how you use these tools personally as well? Do you keep them
Yeah.
in personal accounts and other things like that?
I always put myself online. I'm really glad to be in my 30s. I think it's really hard the younger you are to draw these boundaries. I didn't draw those boundaries when I was younger. I was writing, I mean, when I was a blogger, I was just putting everything out there and I was just oversharing everything about my dating life, my everything. And now I think the older I get, the more I'm kind of like, I draw those boundaries. But I think it's hard too, because when you're young and you're right out of college and you're trying to meet people or whatever, it's like, I get why young people want to share. I was doing the same thing. But the more sort of like your profile grows and the more scrutiny you get, the more you just want to like kind of clamp down. I'm very opinionated online. I just don't post like basically my personal address and family stuff.
Mhm. And do you think there are steps that media organizations can take to protect journalists from that kind of online harassment?
Well, the main thing that they need to do is not punish them. Like that's what they do to not, and I'm lucky enough to have a big enough audience that this doesn't happen to me, but I've seen it happen to younger reporters with smaller footprints. And you've seen it like the girl, what's her name, that got fired from the AP for that ridiculous,
Yes.
she's
Right.
amazing and I forgot her name. But this happens to people that they feel like are disposable, and young reporters are often treated as disposable. And so they'll write a story or they'll make a comment online that then there's manufactured outrage over. And instead of standing by that young reporter, I wrote a story about this happening to student journalists too. The school or the institution will, the news organization will throw them under the bus or fire them or punish them. And that's so fucked up. And the only reason that I feel like haven't had to deal with that as much is because I have a really big platform and audience. And so if it would be like newsworthy if something like that happened. And I think like that sort of like balances the power, but young people don't have that when they're starting out. And so I think that's what they need to do. They need to treat student journalists better and obviously young journalists better so that they aren't subject to that type of stuff.
We have some more questions in the chat. So this one I think is related to what we were just talking about. It says, does that have a chilling effect on young people who may think, man, maybe this isn't for me?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, it sucks. It's terrible. I mean, there's one girl I know that was an intern and was so promising and she was on my beat and I thought she was going to be great and she just quit the industry. She just she couldn't deal with the harassment. And also her news organization was not supporting her. They were like questioning her on all this stuff and putting her stories under, like she was being penalized for these manufactured outrage campaigns around like just from internet fandoms. That's terrible. So I think I'm grateful to be, again, at this point where I started so long ago before those dynamics had really accelerated. And so I didn't have to, when I was growing my platform, I didn't have to deal with that. And I think younger people today, they have to deal with it on a crazy level. And also young people today have been on the internet their whole lives in a public way, in a way, like obviously I had Facebook when I was younger and in college and stuff, but it was like such a different platform. Now young people have such a big online footprint. It's constantly weaponized against them. And I think that makes it harder for young journalists. I think that they feel like they can't be as outspoken, which sucks.
Yeah, I'll say that that was definitely kind of the advice that I got as I was kind of working my way through high school and early college. So, employers will look at everything. They'll look at your tweets, they'll look at your Instagram, all that.
They do. And I honestly think that whole practice is stupid. But
yeah. We have about a minute left here. There was another question from earlier, I think, with our conversation of kind of platforms themselves. It says, curious what Taylor thinks about influencers who may have skeletons in their closet that try to rebrand with support from those companies like YouTube.
oh God, yeah. Or like the David Dobrik Snapchat thing that's happening. I don't even think that's skeletons in the closet. Actually, I think everyone knows the stuff that he's done. But I mean, I think it's bad. I think ultimately these companies just want to make money. And so they don't care what horrible deeds some influencer has done as long as they can profit off them. And you see this constantly. And you'll see like YouTube or Meta like cut ties, with someone and then they secretly sort of start working with them again, or some other platform picks them up and starts giving them millions. And I think that that's horrible. And that's why it's really important to have accountability and to sort of hold these people to account. Unfortunately, again, this is why we need a less profit driven internet, because that's at the root of all evil.
So we're just about out of time here, and this was a really fascinating discussion. So thank you again for joining us. I will say, for those of you on the webinar who are curious in learning more, the book is the best place, I think, to get more of that. So to kind of wrap it up here, would you mind just telling folks where they can find it and find more of your opinions, your thoughts, and answers to questions that we maybe didn't get to here?
Yeah. Well, my book, it's kind of behind me. Oh, I think it fell down. Anyway, it's called Extremely Online. Oh my God, you have it. You can get it anywhere you get books. And then also you can follow me. I don't use Twitter for news as much anymore. So just follow me on Instagram, TikTok. I have a YouTube. Um, Anywhere else, basically, aside from Twitter. I used to mostly use Twitter to keep up with like COVID info now. So I don't really use it for news. I'm on Threads. But yeah, reach out anytime. My DMs are open on Instagram too. I'm slow, but I try to read everything. So if there's ever anything you need or if I could help you or anything, just message me. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This was really great. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thanks. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.